Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to Zatka's technical workshop for the National E-Invoicing Solution. This is going to be a series of workshops where we'll go in details about the Phase 2 requirements of e-invoicing. This specific workshop, we're going to have a quick introduction to e-invoicing, and then we're going to have a look at the two different e-invoicing modules. Later on, we're going to have a quick recap about what are Phase 2 requirements for e-invoicing, and then finally we will have a look at what are the most common CSID or cryptographic stamp ID business scenarios. So as a quick introduction to e-invoicing, back in 2020, 4th of December, we have announced the e-invoicing regulation and we published it over the website. And then in May 28th of 2021, we have published the implementation resolution of e-invoicing. So we have published the controls, the requirements, the technical specifications, and procedural rules for implementing the provisions of the invoicing regulation. Later that year, on the 4th of December of 2021, the generation phase kick-started and we started enforcing our taxpayers or VAT taxpayers to start generating invoices in electronic format. And then in July 1st of 2022, this year, we have announced the first wave of integration of e-invoicing, which will start the enforcement in January 1st of 2023, and then subsequent phases or waves will come after that. So what was phase 1? So phase 1, we call it the generation phase, which started enforcement back in December 4th of 2021. Here exactly what we are doing is that we are asking our taxpayers or VAT taxable persons to start generating and storing compliant tax invoices in an electronic format. So basically move away from the manual way of generating invoices like in paper-based and make them generated in an electronic format. Of course, generation including storing and then adding some specific fields to the invoice, most notably the QR code for the simplified invoices or the invoices targeted for B2C or business to consumer. Now the next phase, which is phase 2, which will start enforcement in January 1st of 2023. This is what we call the integration phase. And mainly what we are requiring our taxpayers is to generate invoices in an XML format and store, of course, the said invoices in the XML format. This XML will also include some additional fields, more specifically some security-based fields such as the cryptographic stamp. And then finally, they need to integrate with Zatka's invoicing platform to report their invoices. So this is in a nutshell what are the, let's say, general differences between phase 1 and phase 2. And our sessions moving on will be focusing about phase 2. So who will be subject to implementing phase 2? So mandatory integration with Zatka will be done in waves. So we have announced wave 1 back in July 1st of 2022. Subsequent waves are yet to be announced. And whenever we announce a wave, we're going to give them a head start of at least 6 months in advance to prepare the environment to start integrating with Zatka e-invoicing solution. So to comply with phase 2, which is the integration phase, there are 4 general requirements. So basically the solution or the invoicing solution at the taxpayer side has to be able to connect to the internet, of course, so they can integrate with Zatka platform. There are some additional fields required in phase 2 that they have to be populated in the invoice. Now said invoice has to be generated and stored in an XML format or a PDF/A3 with the same XML embedded within it. And then finally, they need to integrate their e-invoicing solution with Zatka to share the electronic invoices. Now, more details can be found in our website, zatka.gov.sa. We have a special tab for e-invoicing. You'll find all the technical and non-technical details published there. Moving on, we're going to have a look at the 2 different models of e-invoicing. So we have 2 main models. One is called the simplified invoices. And this is where the business to consumer or customer is happening. Whereas we have a different one, which is for the B2B or business to business, which we call the tax invoices. So in B2B, this is how the model would look like. At the supplier side, they need to generate an e-invoice from their system. And before sharing this invoice, they need to send it to Zatka for clearance. So this is what we call the clearance method or model. Once Zatka clears the invoice, Zatka platform was gonna stamp the invoice and then generate a QR code for said invoice. Once the supplier gets that, they can store this invoice in an XML or PDF/A3 with an embedded XML format, and then and only then they can share it with their buyer. Of course, the buyer has an option to scan the QR code that was printed on the invoice against our Zatka platform to make sure that the invoice is cleared and authentic. This is a sample of how a B2B or a tax invoice would look like. You can see here that we have the QR code. We have the invoice type, which is the tax invoice in this example. We have the reference number. We have the date time stamp as well. We have the information about the seller, along with the additional IDs, such as the commercial registration number. And since this is a B2B invoice, we have to have the buyer information as well, part of the invoice, and then some information about the goods that were sold or the services. And then you'll have the total, the VAT amount, and then the total with the VAT amount. Of course, there are some additional fields that are visible, and then some fields that are not visible on the printable version. You can find more the details about it, and we're going to have a look at it later on in subsequent sessions. Now, when it comes to B2C, this is for businesses who are dealing with consumers or end consumers, like walk-in customers. So basically, the supplier, they need to generate the invoice and share it in a human-readable format with their customers. At the same time, they need to store this invoice at their site, at their machine, and then they will have a grace period of 24 hours to share this invoice with Zatka platform. And this is where we call it the reporting in comparison to clearance that we have seen in B2B. For B2C, we call it reporting, since you have 24 hours clearance. Now, this is due to the sensitivity of the time of the transaction between the supplier and the customer. And of course, we have a similar option where the customer can scan the QR code that was printed by the supplier to check whether this invoice was generated through a registered supplier. Again, this is a sample of how the simplified tax invoice would look like. It's very similar to the tax invoice or the B2B one. However, you'll see that the buyer information is missing from here. So let's have a closer look about phase 2 requirements. So we have published a lot of material on our website regarding the requirements. You're going to have the e-invoicing resolution. You're going to have the data dictionary, which includes all the data fields and their definitions and what sort of input that needs to be done for each data field. You're going to have also details about how the XML implementations look like. And then there is a document for the security features implementation. And then finally, you will have the API specifications in Swagger format. And for testing and validation, we have published 2 tools. The first one is the Compliance and Enablement Toolbox, which is the SDK. This is an offline version to test the compliance of your implementation. And we're going to have a separate dedicated session for that to go over the SDK and how to use it. And then we have also developed an integration sandbox. This is where you can test the integration part of your solution and examine or test your solution against our sandbox. This is in a sandbox environment, so it's in a test environment. It's not in production. You can use that in preparation for your production environment. And again, we're going to have a separate session for the integration sandbox. We're going to go over the details of the sandbox and how to use that. And then finally, we have dedicated a QR code development guide, just only for the QR code, just to give you a step-by-step guide on how to develop the QR code to be printed on your invoices. Now, this is how we envision the journey of our taxpayers or their service providers to be able to be compliant with phase 2 of e-invoicing. We have 4 steps in general. The first 2 are marked as optional. However, they are highly recommended to be done before you start integrating. The first one is the Compliance and Enablement Toolbox. As we mentioned, this is the SDK. I'm going to have a dedicated session for that. Basically, this is an offline tool for you to test the implementation of your system against Zatka requirements. And to access that, you have two options. The first one is to go to the developer portal, which is the sandbox. I'm going to have a look at that. You can either download the SDK and use it in an offline mode, or you can use our portal-based validator. This is mainly targeted for non-technical users, where you can drag and drop the XMLs to validate those XMLs against Zatka requirements. The other option to access the SDK is through our Zatka website. If you go to zatka.gov.sa, we have a section dedicated for e-invoicing, and under that there is a section for developers. You'll find the same version of the SDK as well there, ready to be downloaded. And again, we're going to have a separate session for the SDK to go over it and see how it can be used. The next step, which is the integration sandbox. The purpose of this is to do an actual integration against Zatka in a sandbox environment, which is like a test environment. It's not non-production. Basically, we're going to have to go to sandbox.zatka.gov.sa. You're going to have to navigate to the integration sandbox, and then you're going to have a look at all the API documentation via Swagger. We have 6 main APIs: the compliance CSID API, compliance checks APIs, production CSID APIs for onboarding, and similarly for renewal. And then finally, the 2 APIs for submitting e-invoicing in a reporting mode, which is the B2C, and in a clearance mode for B2B. And again, we're going to have a dedicated session for the integration sandbox to go over all the useful tools there and see how you can test your solution against a sandbox environment. The next step is, once you made sure that you are able to generate an XML in a correct format and you're able to integrate with Zatka, then here you need to onboard your solutions before you start sending invoices. So we have an onboarding portal, fatura.zatka.gov.sa. On that portal, you'll be able to onboard your solution and acquire a cryptographic stamp or a CSID to be able to send your e-invoices. So to access that, you're going to have to go to fatura.zatka.gov.sa. You're going to select how many devices that you want to onboard. You'll receive an OTP for each device to be onboarded. Once you onboard the device, you'll be able to run the APIs in sequence, which is the compliance first and then the compliance checks. And then you're going to request for a production CSID. Once you get this production CSID, then you'll be ready for the next step. We're going to have a dedicated session for onboarding portal as well, to see how you can onboard your devices and be ready to submit the invoices. Now, finally, once you have onboarded your devices, now and only then you can start send invoices against Zatka e-invoicing platform in a clearance or reporting model, depending on the type of business that you are dealing with. So basically, if you're dealing with a B2B transaction, we're gonna use the clearance API, which is the standard document. And if you're using or dealing with a B2C transaction, then you're gonna send simplified documents in a reporting API. Zatka platform is going to do the validation and confirm back to you the submission of your invoice. And in case of a standard document, as we have mentioned previously, Zatka is going to stamp this invoice for you and then generate a QR code for you to be printed on the invoice. Now, let's have a look at what are the most common cryptographic stamp business scenarios. So the very basic business scenario is that we have a taxpayer with a single server that they are generating and sending invoices to Zatka. So in that server, you need to acquire a CSID, as we have seen in the previous steps. Now, another example is that if you have one single taxpayer with multiple points of sales, each of these points of sales are generating and sending the invoices to Zatka platform. So each individual point of sale will have to have acquired CSID. So this CSID has to be unique across all of these devices. So no 2 devices will have the same CSID. So each point of sale will have to go through the steps of the onboarding that we have seen previously. Now, in case the taxpayer has a centralized server where they are issuing and sending the invoices, so the point of sale here is not generating or sending, they are actually getting the invoice from a centralized server and then sending the invoice from the centralized server to Zatka e-invoicing platform. So in that case, the point of sale does not have to have CSID. Only the centralized server will have a CSID. since the centralized server is issuing and sending the invoices. Now, another example is that where the point of sale is actually issuing but not sending. So the point of sale is issuing the invoice and then sending it to a centralized server, where this server is sending it to Zatka. So in that case, each single point of sale will have to have a CSID to generate the invoice. And then the centralized server who is going to send the invoice to Zatka is also required to have a CSID. So the difference between this example and the previous one is that the central server in this case is not issuing the invoice, it's only sending, whereas in the previous example, the same server is issuing and sending the invoices. Now, a bit more complicated example is that, for example, if you have a taxpayer with multiple branches, each branch is having, let's say, a dedicated server internal in the branch, and then they have like a regional server or a central server to consolidate all the invoices and then sending it to Zatka. So in that case, if the point of sale is not issuing or sending an invoice, so they don't need to have CSID. However, the local or the, let's say, branch server is issuing an invoice but not sending this. So in that case, they will have to have a unique CSID per server. And then finally, the centralized server, which is sending to Zatka, would need to have a CSID. So as a general rule of thumb, any machine that is either issuing or sending to Zatka would have to have a CSID. So this is a quick introduction to Zatka e-invoicing solution. Subsequent workshops will go over the tools that we have mentioned. We'll have a workshop for the SDK, another one for the integration sandbox, and then finally we'll have a workshop on the onboarding. Thank you very much.